What's up, Reef Builders? Welcome back to another episode of the Reef Therapy Podcast. This is episode 129, brought to you by Cali Kid Corals, the ultimate coral experience. On this episode, I'm joined by Travis Brandwood. We're going to be discussing all things jellyfish and much, much more. Travis, thanks for coming on today. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you coming on the show. I think we should probably start with an introduction to you. Why don't you explain to the listeners what your background is and what you're about?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am all about jellyfish. I've been keeping them for, I think, around 14 years now. I've kept over 60 species at this point. I actually have a collection of about 60 species of jellyfish. So I've been keeping them since I was in high school. I started raising them in my mom's garage. They were my favorite thing at the public aquariums. I was, raced to see the jellyfish exhibit at the very end. So I grew up on a koi farm. So my dad raised koi fish here in North Carolina. So I've always been around freshwater aquariums and aquaculture and all that. And then my first introduction to marine aquariums was jellyfish because, again, I saw them at the public aquariums and I thought, why can't I figure out how to do that? So I gave it a try and it kind of became a rabbit hole for me of, I started keeping moon jellyfish, which is a lot of people's introductory species. But then I wanted to learn how to raise them, grow my own. And then I started gathering different species and kind of amassed this whole collection, over the last decade or so.
Wow. So were those commercially available at the time, the moon jellies, or did you have to collect them?
It was very early in the hobby. So there weren't that many tanks available, and jellyfish wise, there were maybe one or two companies that were either growing them or kind of supplementing with wild caught ones. So the first ones I got, they imported from Hawaii. And then I think I ordered a second batch that were from either California or Japan. It was but they were both wild caught at the time. Yeah.
So are you keeping them like in bowls or buckets, or what were you doing back then in the early days?
Yeah, so tanks were super expensive back then. You were like thousands of dollars for them, and I was just a high schooler. I didn't have thousands of dollars to be spending on jellyfish. So I made my own tank. I took one of those, the Biorb tanks?
Yeah.
Yeah, they make a cylinder version, and I modified that for jellyfish. So yeah, a couple $100 later, I had jellyfish in my room.
That's awesome. So before we go off the deep end and really start talking about jellies, maybe like a quick kind of explanation of like, here's jellyfish, here's maybe like their life cycle or rudimentary sense, how closely they're related to coral, anemones, and then maybe going into here's why they need a different tank. And then we can really go into deeper into it, I think.
Right, yeah. So jellyfish is actually how I got into reef keeping as well. Because they're not all that different. So like cnidarians, we think of, it's corals, anemones, and jellyfish. Those kind of your like three categories. And obviously in reef tanks, we keep corals and anemones. But jellyfish are related. Their life cycle is fairly similar. It's just that they have this like free swimming jellyfish stage. So they have the same sedentary, life stages that corals have. They have a polyp stage, which looks like a tiny anemone. And one of my favorite subjects to talk about is that polyp stage ends up in people's reef tanks all the time. People are getting upside down jellyfish babies or hydroids. People are old complaining about hydroids, but most of them have a jellyfish stage in their life cycle. But anyway, so yeah, they're very similar to corals and anemones. I like to describe jellyfish as anemones that swim. And that kind of brings me into why you can't keep them, in a regular saltwater aquarium. So like you probably experienced at one point in time an anemone crawling into a power head and just, blending up. Same thing with jellyfish. You wouldn't want to put it in a regular aquarium because it would get sucked into a power head or, blended or whatever. So that's why you need a specialized aquarium for jellyfish, is because A, the filtration in a normal aquarium will blend them up, but B, jellyfish aren't very good at swimming. So they need, some sort of supplementary flow to keep them suspended in the water. And that sounds really complicated, but now we're so far into the jellyfish hobby now that there are some really creative options that aren't very expensive or difficult. And we can kind of get into that too. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's a good segue. Is what are kind of the available models or methods of a tank, so to speak, that are on the market, and which ones do you prefer, and which ones would you think would maybe not be as good?
Yeah, so the kind of OG jellyfish tank, the chrysal that everybody talks about, is that like circle that spins them around. And those are, they kind of were responsible for all of the tanks we have today. They made jellyfish keeping possible, but they were designed in the 60s. So we've come a long way. Those are the ones that used to cost like 10 grand, and they look like a nuclear reactor or whatever. So the next one in line is the pseudo-chrysal, which is actually what you see sold a lot these days. It has like the spray bar, and it may or may not be fully round. It might be like a U shape. But there's some great options coming out now, like the tumbler is basically just a cube. Doesn't necessarily need like rounded edges. It just needs like a spray bar to create that spinning motion that keeps the jelly suspended. And then there's cylinders as well. I think honestly, the pseudo-chrysal and the tumbler tanks are my favorite. They're the cheapest. They work well. They support a wide variety of jellyfish, so you don't get yourself boxed in. Yeah, all around great tanks.
So do you think you could realistically, like, how easy would it be to mod like an all-in-one to like a tumbler? Could you just put a spray bar on the return and maybe like fine mesh foam in the overflow compartment or something? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the aquariums in my jelly lab are just like standard, glass boxes that I've glued some acrylic into and a spray bar. So it's definitely doable. If for anyone that wants to get started with jellyfish keeping, I always recommend like buying one, that's available on the market, because it is sort of the life support system for your jellyfish. So if you get that right, then jellyfish keeping becomes a whole lot easier. But once you do that and you kind of get used to keeping jellyfish, then you can really start branching out and getting creative and building your own tanks for way cheaper. Yeah.
so do you think that probably so flow seems kind of like the biggest difference or largest challenge to overcome? So let's say people can get that down. They buy a tank, they make a tank. What comes next? What else is difficult, or is it relatively easy after that?
After that point, it's pretty straightforward. It's a lot like reef keeping. You're doing water changes like weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. It really depends on the size of the tank again. Jellyfish are, when it comes to water quality, they're pretty similar to soft corals. They don't care so much about nitrate and phosphate. It's not that big of a deal for them. They don't use up alkalinity or calcium, so you're not dosing anything. I recommend doing water changes just to keep your water quality like stable and, relatively within wraps. But like nitrates, for example, keep them below 40 and they'll be fine. They'll be happy. Feeding wise, that was a big one for a while. But there's all kinds of like pellet foods available now. Certain species of jellyfish will eat like frozen mysis. Yeah, if you want to, you can hatch out brine shrimp. Freshly hatched brine shrimp is an awesome food for pretty much any jellyfish, but like certain more difficult species, they kind of eat. If you're just keeping like your standard moon jelly, they'll eat just about anything.
So when it comes to what makes a species more difficult, is that just a question of like availability plus like a particle size thing, or like live food versus like, is it like how picky they are when it comes to eating, or what makes something more difficult?
Yeah, it's a lot like keeping corals, because you have some corals that you could put in a box and like they do well no matter what, and then there are some that like you have to be on top of everything. Jellyfish are very similar. Again, like your common moon jelly, they're forgiving of like if your flow's not dialed in quite right, or what you're feeding or water quality. And then there are some jellyfish that's like the flow has to be really dialed in. Feeding, you got to be feeding the right items specific to them, stuff like that. Temperature, some jellies are cold water, most of them are not. Yeah, stuff like that.
So yeah, back to water quality. I mean, softies can be, like you said, pretty forgiving. Is this something you want to be using like RODI for, or can you just use straight up RO and they aren't sensitive to the elevated traces, so to speak?
The biggest thing is they're sensitive to metals in the water. Copper and zinc are big ones, so I wouldn't use like straight tap water.
Yeah.
But like distilled water, RO water, that's fine as long as you're doing some preliminary filtration where you're getting out the majority of, metals. That's the biggest thing.
And then, so yeah, this is kind of like all more pelagic stuff. So what about like upside down jellyfish? I've seen people keep those in some reefs and such. Is there really a trick to them? Or, I mean, they have zooxanthellae, don't they?
Right, yeah, they're photosynthetic, and you can keep them in like a refugium or something. Like they can handle a decent amount of flow. I wouldn't put them in like a full-blown reef tank, but like
Yeah.
a flow through refugium would be fine. And like you said, they are photosynthetic, so they get a lot of their nutrition from light. I would still feed them occasionally with like freshly hatched brine shrimp or something, because they're like a filter feeder, so they need kind of like fine particle foods. But yeah, they kind of break a lot of the rules. They don't like being kept in those tanks that push them around. They don't want to be spinning. They want to lay on the bottom and grow algae all the time. So yeah, they're way easier. And if you want to get into jellyfish keeping, but you're not ready to like pounce on, getting the whole tank set up and all that, you could just get a couple upside down jellies and keep them in like a refugium or something.
So you think so upside down jellies, moon jellies, once you get the full setup, what's kind of the steps above that as you progress into keeping them?
Dwarf lion's mane jellies are one of my favorite species to work with. They are like bomb proof. They are super forgiving of like parameter shifts or common beginner mistakes, stuff like that. And they look really cool. They're like kind of reddish purple, and they have those long tentacles. They look more like a classic jellyfish. Sometimes I think they're easier than moon jellies, honestly, because they're so forgiving. So those are good options. Marbled jellyfish are cool. They kind of have that like round, sphere shape. Way more active, full of personality. They're kind of fun to watch. They're a little more chaotic, I guess, compared to like jelly, which is very relaxed and chill. The marble jellyfish, they move around a lot, and they're using up all 360 degrees of space in their tank. So there's another good option for beginners. Yeah, those are the kind of the four that I recommend.
So sourcing, I've seen moon jellies available a lot of places. Upside down jellies like Quality Marine, like I've seen shops get them in. But the other two species, where's someone trying to buy those at?
Yeah, so they are slowly becoming more and more available. The dwarf lion's manes I actually originally bred a couple years ago. Like they're native to the Atlantic, so I went and caught them. And I was selling them through my company, Jellyfish Warehouse, for a while. I kind of scaled that company back a little bit so I could do more jellyfish research. But in the meantime, like I've shared, those with other companies that ship all over. So they're starting to become more and more available on the market. I think it's just taking, time for people to kind of catch up and get used to it,
Yeah, it's definitely a different side of it's very adjacent type of hobby, I would say. That's why, like, I wanted to have you on. I'm like, I feel like this is like a very applicable thing for many reef keepers. And honestly, it seems like it's a little bit easier than like, especially like an SPS tank, you don't have to water change, feed, and you're good.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like if you can keep SPS corals, you can keep jellyfish all day long. It's way easier.
Yeah, so you've got 60 species. So what are you doing in like your little jellyfish lab? Why don't you talk about that some?
Yeah, so right out of high school, I started a company called the Jellyfish Warehouse because I was really into jellyfish keeping, but I was frustrated with like the lack of availability, the tanks, the cost, all that. So I started selling jellyfish in aquariums, and I got really into like the research side of it. I started working with these different species and learning how to raise them and all that. And I realized like that's where my passion is, right? So I actually like moved out of the commercial space that I was in and built this like jellyfish laboratory in my backyard. Like, yeah, I had a concrete slab poured and put this like 700 square foot garage down and just designed it like entirely around jellyfish. I mean, kind of like the Reef Builder Studio, but for jellyfish.
Huh.
But so I realized like the jellyfish research in general is kind of lacking. There's all these species found all over the planet. And, even some of these are commonly kept in public aquariums, but like there's no photos of them or their life stages. People don't know what parameters to keep them at, where do they thrive, what do they eat. And so I realized there was kind of like this open gap for it. So the first thing I wanted to do was just start photographing and documenting like every species, take a picture of every stage of their life cycle and make it freely available. And then I started working on like information on how to keep them. Like, okay, here's how I keep them. And I started reading through like all of the scientific literature that's not readily available to hobbyists or, the average person. And I tried to like translate it and just offer it in one place. So there's no paywalls or anything, it's all there. So that's just kind of something I work on in my spare time. It's called the Jellyfish Compendium Project. Goal is to eventually document every species, or at least as many as I can get my hands on. But yeah.
I was gonna say like this is like a jellyfish like lexicon. A compendium is a much better word. That's great. So okay, so how do you go about getting all these species? You kind of mentioned a little bit of this to me at Reef Stock. Why don't you share? I mean, I thought it was pretty wicked. Why don't you share some of that?
Yeah, it's actually cool. It's almost reminiscent of the reefing hobby like back in the 90s. So like I was saying with the dwarf lion's mane jellyfish, like I actually went to North Carolina, found them, brought back a couple adults, and started raising them in captivity. And then, I talk with all of these different hobbyists, like in Europe or Asia or wherever, all over the world. And they're raising their local species and I'm raising mine. And we just kind of do like a swap. Like I send them some of my local species and they send me whatever cool ones they have. And eventually you kind of end up with this, whole collection and you can trade them like trading cards or something.
So what was the most difficult one to source?
That's a great question. There are still some that are really difficult. Like it's getting kind of funny. Like some of these universities and public aquariums are almost sending out like agents to other parts of the world to like collect these jellyfish and bring them back. And they invest a bunch of money into this, or they'll be doing it like with a university, and so they can't share the species until they're done publishing their information. So in a way, it's kind of like jellyfish gatekeeping. But
yeah.
Some of those are really difficult to get a hold of right now, but eventually they end up trickling into the hobby or they end up in some other public aquarium that can share them. So yeah, there's a couple like that I've been like looking out for, but they're still kind of, stuck somewhere and they're being researched or whatever.
So is that like you have like a holy grail jellyfish, so to speak, like one you've wanted for years type of thing?
I think so. And I think the Holy Grail is right in front of me. So we have 3 species of box jellyfish in like the North Carolina area and up and down the East Coast. But box jellyfish are like the most difficult to keep, right? Like they have this reputation of being like deadly and super stingy, but they're also really sensitive. So they need like perfect water quality, and their life cycles have only been like partially discovered. But there's one species we have called Chirapsalmus that shows up almost every summer. And like no one's ever bred it. No one's ever done really anything with it. Everybody knows it's there, but no one's been able to keep them longer than a few days in captivity. And a few years ago, I got like, I don't know, 20% of the way through their life cycle, like started to breed them, and then I hit a brick wall. and like have not been able to crack the code since. So I think that's like that's the one.
So where in the life cycle did you encounter the issue?
So they have like, so jellyfish are male and female. So they spawn, they produce like fertile eggs that develop into a larvae. And it's a lot like spawning corals, right? Like they have this little planula larvae that, swims around and finds a rock or something that it wants to settle on in the ocean. And then from there, that turns into a polyp. And then that polyp eventually will start producing jellyfish asexually. So I got them to the planula larvae, and then they settled as polyps, and then they just stopped growing. It was super weird. They never developed a mouth, so I couldn't feed them. And it was like everything I tried would make them more angry. Like if I did a water change, they would get angry and die. If I brought the temperature up or down, they would get angry and die.
So what do you think went wrong? Do you have like any theories?
I don't know. I started talking to everybody, right? Like I even talked to like top researchers in Australia who study like their version of this species, the one that kills people. And like they've gotten to like similar spots, basically. Like this is kind of like a great wall that everyone runs into with this group of jellyfish. And nobody can figure out what's missing, but it seems like it almost seems like they're waiting for something, like they're missing some like chemical, or maybe they need like a certain bacteria that they communicate. I think about like mycelium with mushrooms, how they like communicate with the forest.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder if there's like some missing symbiont or like a bacterial strain that they need that sends like a chemical signal. I don't know.
Like when you said that, honestly, it made me think of, I know a lot of research with settlements and successful development of coral has come from, farming particular strains of coralline algae because they'll produce whatever chemical signals are needed to continue development. So it's like if they settled, but then did develop, it's maybe it's like maybe you need to have substrate from like where you find them or something. I don't know. That's weird.
Right. Well, and that becomes a tricky thing, right? Because they cannot stand inshore water. Like they come from offshore, and like they get blown in or whatever, or tides. But like if they hit like that dirty inshore water, it's over. It doesn't matter if you put them back in clean water, like something about it. And that's the adults. But I was thinking about that. I was like, what if I can collect like some substrate from their environment? But their environment's like, 10 miles offshore, 20 miles offshore, and probably like 100 feet down in the ocean. I'd have to really find someone in a niche area that is willing to, I guess, dredge up rock or substrate. I don't know.
That's like a job for Todd Gardner, it sounds like.
Exactly. He already goes out in there and dives. He just needs to bring it back a handful of rocks or something.
So yeah, are they settling that deep down, like hundreds of feet down, or is it even known?
Yeah, no one's ever found their life stages in the wild. I was at a college recently, and they have like a collection of animals in formalin, like different sea creatures they've preserved over the years, and they had a box jelly of that species that was like this big, and I got crazy excited because I was like, that's the smallest anyone's ever seen. Like that's a huge deal. So yeah, who knows?
Interesting. So like no box jelly species, or is it just a select like subspecies or family of them has not been bred?
It's a subspecies thing. So like box jellies can be divided into two, and one side, like you can basically breed any of them. They're still hard, but like it's been done. And I've ever been gotten past this like initial polyp stage. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Now I'm like pumped. I'm like waiting for like 5 years from now, and you're like, I finally bred the box jellyfish. We figured it out. We needed to put it in a pressure chamber, like or some crazy.
Right? Yeah. It turns out they're like deep sea. They have like half of their life cycle is like way down in the ocean or something.
Yeah, you've got to like mimic it. Like I don't know. That's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
So okay. So those are kind of the ultimates, like unknown unknowns of the Jellyfish Compendium project. Where are you making some progress right now? What's your current thing you're working on?
been working on. I just got back the other day from collecting jellyfish like locally here. We get a couple lion's mane jellyfish species here, like the dwarf lion's mane, which is red, but we also get this like weird yellowish orange species. Um, and like the taxonomy of some jellyfish is just like a train wreck, right? Like yeah, it's been like bad since the 1800s or whatever when they were collecting them originally. Um, so like I went and bought a bunch of like PCR equipment, like a thermal cycler,
Oh,
like DNA barcoding. Yeah, with some helpful donations from my family, I went and acquired a bunch of this equipment so I can start trying to like untangle these species that are sitting there right in front of us. Like they're not even in a different country or something. They're right there, but no one has taken the time to sequence their DNA and like really start comparing them to see. So that's kind of where I am now. I'm gonna go through and sequence like every species in my collection. Yeah, and just figure out what's what.
I think it's pretty cool how you're doing it in your backyard. And modern science and academia has not even got around to this yet. That's a testament to like the not gatekeeping, but kind of like the bureaucracy of academia in today's world. It's like I feel like there's so much low hanging fruit out there that could be
Oh
done.
yeah,
Just like it's just like effortless work. And if you've got the equipment, you can sequence it and publish the data, but you got to have the grants and you got to have a reason, and it's kind of
exactly.
sad.
It's the funding thing for sure. And jellyfish are kind of bottom of the totem pole, right? Like even talking to like Fish and Wildlife on the East Coast here, like most of them don't care. They
Yeah.
care more about like game fish or what's being harvested and all that. And I understand that. Like I'm not knocking on it, but like jellyfish sting how many people a year? Thousands. Um, and like certain species of jellyfish can grow back any part of their body. Like they have crazy abilities of regeneration. Like I feel like they're just ripe for scientific research. I'm sure there's all sorts of things that can be discovered, but yeah, people just aren't focusing on it. So I think you have to be crazy passionate about it and just start. Whatever you can't do in a university lab, you can do in your backyard, I guess.
So are there other people like you? Is there like a Travis Brandwood of like Europe and Asia, like people you're collaborating with, or are you it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and in fact, when I first built this jellyfish lab in my backyard last year, I had like several different people come from like foreign countries. Like I had a guy from China fly all the way in to just like talk, like see everything, and just have like a full day of like jellyfish nerding. Um, People from some European aquariums have come. So I live in Charlotte, but I live like north of Charlotte, North Carolina, kind of not in the middle of nowhere, but like outside of the main city. And I had this European aquarium CEO like in a suit, like in my backyard in my jellyfish garage. And I was like, this is just the weirdest thing ever, right? Like this guy is overwhelmingly European.
That's so funny. Like
Yeah,
had to like take a back road like in North Carolina to go to the backyard jellyfish lab.
exactly. Right. And my neighbors have no idea what I'm doing. They just see the blue glow coming out of my windows at night and think, oh God, what is this? What is this guy doing?
Dude, that's such a funny thing. When I lived in my college town in Topeka, Kansas, which is like the meth lab capital of the world, I had like I was just wheeling in my autoclave and like an incubator, and everyone in the apartment complex saw this glowing light, and they're like, "Oh my God!" Like I could not imagine what they were thinking in the moment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my electrical bill, like the light going out of the garage. And yeah, I've got so many flasks and all that. And my neighbors are
You're
just
gonna
like,
get raided, man.
yeah. And, I look forward to that day because they aren't going to know what to do with it.
Yeah, like what? You do what? Like they're not even gonna comprehend it. I mean, that's funny. Huh.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, we had that brief conversation at Reef Stock, and you talked to me about kind of how you can, you have the whole thing of spawning where you can then have them at the polyp stage after they've settled. Maybe talk a little bit about how you're actually propagating jellyfish to spread them around the world.
Yeah, so jellyfish, like I said, they spawn normally. Like they have male and female jellyfish that produce these polyps. But then they live in this polyp stage like indefinitely. So jellyfish are seasonal and they can live on the ocean floor or whatever as a polyp until there's some sort of environmental cue that tells them, okay, it's time to be a jellyfish. Um, so for some species, it's springtime, so they're expecting the temperature to go up and the salinity to go down. Or it's the opposite; they want the temperature to go down. And so every species has their own like combination of water parameter changes. But when they're in this polyp stage, they behave a lot like corals or like a zoa or a mushroom, where they'll split themselves in half and make more of themselves. And so you can start out with even just one polyp, and in a couple months' time, you can have a whole colony of them. And as long as you keep them like at a stable temperature and water parameter, they'll just stay as a polyp like for years.
Hmm.
I think the oldest ones I've had are like 8 years old. And then, when you're ready, you can just put some in a refrigerator or warm the temperature up or whatever, and then you can have baby jellyfish. So polyps can live in like a 2-gallon aquarium with a bubbler. Like they're like the opposite of jellyfish. Like they do not care. They live attached to stuff, so you can grow them on like a petri dish or a frag plug or whatever you have laying around, something hard that they can grow on. And I mean, you can literally keep them in the corner of your bedroom or your garage or whatever for, like I said, indefinitely until you're ready to raise them. So, I mean, they're great for like schools and universities because you can grow them in a lab somewhere in the corner. But I think, honestly, there's a huge potential for people raising them in their garages, just like people do corals. Because you can send people these polyps, you can send them 10 and they can get their own culture started, and start raising jellyfish on their own.
So how big are the polyps? Does it depend on the species or?
It does, but most of them are like tiny.
Yeah.
Like we're talking 1/4 inch in size, and like that's kind of big for them. So like smaller than a zoa, but very similar in the way that they form these like colonies. Like they'll just form a mat on the bottom of whatever tank you're keeping them in.
So could you take some jewelry tools and like the wearable magnifying glass and like frag these things, or do you just waiting game?
Most of the time it's a waiting game. I just did some research like where we were basically fragging polyps to see if you could, and it does work for the most part. But some of these species grow like alarmingly fast. Like upside down jellyfish polyps, they actually bud. Like they send off these little buds that swim away, and they can start producing like maybe 5 or 6 at a time. So I mean, you can do the math. Like if you have 10 polyps and each of them is producing like 5 buds a week, like the numbers that they multiply very quickly.
So what are you feeding them at this stage? I'm assuming that's pretty low micron stuff at that point.
Yeah, usually it's brine shrimp. Most of the common species that you're working with, moon jellies, upside down jellies, like their polyps are pretty hardy. They'll just eat freshly hatched brine shrimp. Some of the smaller species need rotifers. That's kind of a pain in the butt.
I was going to say that's fun.
Yeah, right, exactly. But those are usually the more complicated ones, really small species. Most of them will eat brine shrimp, and they only need to be fed like twice a week.
Oh,
it's not that big of a commitment. Yeah. Because when they're in age, they're sedentary, so they're not using up a lot of energy. So you can feed them twice a week. And then when you're getting ready to transition them to jellyfish, you can start power feeding them to like you make sure they have enough nutrition to get away with it. But for the most part, they're really low maintenance.
So I'm assuming you're hatching a lot of brine shrimp.
Yeah, I buy the like the coffee can size containers from the brine shrimp supplier. Yeah, and I'm hatching brine shrimp daily.
Yeah. So what's how you have like a special way of doing that? Have you found a very efficient way of hatching brine shrimp?
I just have one of those hatchers I bought online. I got the one that looks like a blender,
Yeah.
just because it has like you can put the heater in it, and then it's got the valve on the bottom. But to be honest, no, I don't have like a fancy way of doing it. I just do it that way, and then uh, I put the heater in there, so they hatch in like 18 to 24 hours, and then good to go.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you had like cutting edge brine shrimp hatching like development. You had some secret method. It's like they hatch in 3 hours. I have a
Right.
100% hatch rate. Takes 2 minutes.
I sometimes I decapsulate the eggs, which is like where you melt the eggshell off with bleach, because the eggshells jellyfish can't digest them. That's like a common issue. Like if whether you're raising jellyfish or seahorses or cephalopod, like the shell becomes an issue. Um, but for the most part, I just use light to separate them. Like brine shrimp are attracted to light, so you put them in a big flat dish and they all go to one side. If you put a flashlight there or whatever. But yeah, sometimes I decapsulate them. That shortens the hatching process because they don't have to break out of an actual egg anymore. But then you've got to do the decapsulating process, which is not a ton of fun. So sometimes
It's like the same amount of time either way at that point.
Exactly. Right. So either way, but
So we've talked about feeding. We've talked about kind of some general care, what you're all about and what you're doing. Maybe we go into troubleshooting jellyfish stuff. So obviously people get coral, get it from the wild. You do a dip. You might have gray bugs, red bugs, whatever. Are there like any known kind of parasites or pests when it comes to jellyfish?
yeah, that's a good question. It kind of segues into another topic. So, like almost all of the jellyfish offered now for sale are captive bred. It's super cool as a niche hobby because you look at like the rest of the saltwater aquarium hobby and you can see how we're making progress with like aquaculture, but still like most of the fish and corals we get in are wild caught. But with jellyfish, like there's only one or two species left that are regularly wild caught. But pest wise, like if you do get them from the wild, a lot of the times they do come in with um, various types of pests, like the blubber jellies. We talked about those at Reef Stock as well. The like colorful ones that move around a lot. Those guys come in almost always with this like species of giant copepod that is not supposed to be parasitic. It's more like a neutral kind of association. But when you put them in captivity, I think the copepod does more harm than good. Like they're crawling around on the jellyfish, eating their slime coat and tearing holes in them. So that's one of the pests you'll get on wild caught jellies. Mostly the blubbers, though. Past that, there aren't a ton of like specific diseases or pests they get. With jellyfish, it's usually opportunistic. So like if your water quality suddenly takes a dip or the jellyfish scrapes itself on something, they can be prone to getting like generalized bacterial infections or ciliates or kind of all of the above. Whatever's in the tank already that isn't necessarily pathogenic can do harm to them with the right environment.
So what's treatment for? I mean, are they really sensitive to some meds? Is it kind of like general treatment for coral? Can you do like a potassium chloride bath to get rid of the copepods, for instance, stuff like that?
For those like parasitic copepods, I've done reef dips. I've done both the iodine one and then like the two little fishies revive, and that works out great. Like that does it. I wouldn't do the potassium dip. Certain like salts like that can be lethal to jellyfish in high concentrations. So yeah, you can use like certain dips for sure.
That's kind of crazy. I've never really thought about like the process of dipping jellies, but that makes a lot of sense.
It feels a little weird. Like dipping a coral makes sense, but like putting a jellyfish in a bath of dip is very strange.
Right, like I've never like dipped in it. I mean, like you could treat NEMS with antibiotics, but I've never dipped in anemone. I mean, that's not
Right.
not very commonplace. So,
Right.
huh. So you don't think there's any significant issues from the aquaculture facilities? Nothing really running around in those, which could be a problem.
Not as far as I can tell. The way jellyfish are cultured helps out a lot. Like when you have them in that polyp stage, you're keeping them in a tank, and like that's basically it, right?
Hmm.
Like the polyps are just growing on some rocks or whatever. But then when they turn into jellyfish, you have to move them from their polyp tank to a jellyfish tank. So you're taking very little with them. They're going from being this like sedentary thing to becoming free swimming. And so there's very little going into their new environment. And so it only takes a few generations of doing this before there's like almost nothing.
Yeah, I guess it's like implicit tank transfer, just kind of built into the process, like 20
Right.
times.
Right,
Wow.
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I don't live by the coast, so I don't have to worry about like contamination that way. And otherwise, I have rarely anything show up in my tanks. No weird sponges, no hydroids, nothing like that.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
is there a preferred kind of substrate to have the polyps settle and grow out on? Is there anything that's really comparable, like, more or less growth, stuff like that?
Um, yeah, a lot of grad students have done tests on this where they've like seen, a bunch of different materials and what they prefer. And it depends on the species, but a lot of the times it's just what's available. Jellyfish are really well adapted to grow in environments that are open to them. So they'll grow in the dark. They don't love growing in places that are brightly lit because then you tend to get like fouling organisms like algae. But any like semi-porous material, I mean, even glass they'll grow on. Yeah.
Hmm. So you can sit like on the walls of a tank theoretically, just like a bare bottom tank, and that's ready to rock.
Yep. Absolutely.
So how do you see, like as you talked about, you could see people as this grows eventually kind of growing them in their garage and trading different species. I mean, what do you see? Like, what's the easiest way to transport these polyps between people? Things like that.
I mean, you can ship them in small bags of water or cups. Like, you know how people will send frags and like those specimen cups? That would be fine.
Hmm.
Um, it's very similar in the way that you can scrape like an anemone or a coral off of something and it'll reattach later. You can do that with jellyfish polyps. Or you can grow them on like a petri dish and send the entire dish to someone.
So do you just have the polyps kind of chill with low flow, or is there like an adhesive you can use?
Yeah, normally you just like you scrape them off, you send them, and then the person puts them in a tank. And basically, for the first week or so, you provide low to no flow because they'll be fine in standing water for like weeks. I
Hmm.
mean, it's really absurd how how hardy they are at this phase. So yeah, you just let them attach over like a week or so, and then you can turn the flow back up and start feeding them on all that.
So where do you see like the jellyfish hobby going right now? What's the rooms for like, room for improvement? What are the trends? What's the future of it?
I think honestly, the best possible like future for the jellyfish hobby is where people are kind of raising their own jellyfish, trading or swapping, because I think that's where the real innovation is going to happen. Like I was kind of talking about before, like jellyfish are kind of lacking in the funding department for research, and even at public aquariums where they're one of the most popular exhibits, there's not as much like experimenting going on. And I think someone raising them in their garage with a limited budget, that's where people are going to get really creative. And where people are going to start figuring out, like new ways of keeping jellyfish or how to raise that new species that no one's been able to do, stuff like that. So I think that's huge. And then building tanks as well, like experimenting with that. There's already so many great options available. And I think, again, like when people are doing it in a limited environment, they're going to discover some new ways of keeping jellyfish.
What do you think about like bowls? Standard bowl. Go to Petco and buy one.
Yeah, I think in certain environments that absolutely would work. Comb jellies, which they're not actually a jellyfish at all, but they're a ctenophore. But they're those guys that like they look like they're glowing. They have the little cilia on them. I raise those 100% in glass bowls that I got from the craft store, like
Hmm.
adults, babies, larvae. I raise them 100% in glass bowls with bubblers because that's what they that's where they do best. Yeah, like I've kept them in standard jellyfish tanks, and they can be kind of finicky. But when they're in a bowl like this and they're just surrounded by food all the time, they love that. So I think there's certainly, I think that's a great example of like not overthinking it and having limited resources. Because I've seen some like designs for raising comb jellies that public aquariums or labs have come up with, and they're like crazy complicated. And then some people are over here raising them in fish bowls.
I'm glad you mentioned combs, because that was a species that I really was interested in. I've always liked them. Like, remember, like on the beach, like Florida and stuff on vacation, you'd find them all the time. And all the deep sea documentaries, it's like crazy footage. So are they more difficult? You said a lot of food. Is it kind of a constant barrage of food?
Yeah, so the most common species that's kept is like they're very voracious. They're voracious predators. They're actually super invasive too, and will decimate like fish populations where they've been introduced. But honestly, yeah, like keeping them in bowls like that and providing them with enough food is a big part of it. They're a little more delicate than like a jellyfish is. They're like a higher percentage of water, so they're just like physically more delicate. But they can regrow from like a clump of cells. Oh, and they can spawn 14 days after they're born.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So like at one point I was raising these and I had like 20 generations going, like after just like a year of doing it, like it was on like F20. So like that's another goal of mine, right? Like I want to see someone domesticate a jellyfish. Like,
That's so cool.
yeah.
So what's like the lifespan of, I mean, as like an actual adult form, I know that some can like, I think, revert back to a polyp and stuff. I mean, what's the lifespan of an adult? Is it infinite, so to speak, or no?
Yeah, so like that's a huge like complaint I get when people are talking about keeping jellyfish is people say, "Oh, I thought they didn't live that long. I thought they only lived a couple months to a year." And that's one of those like myths that has been introduced because it's a lot easier to explain why something's not doing well just by saying, "Oh, they have a short lifespan." Like, "Oh, I kept it for a few months and then it died." It's probably just a short lifespan. But as people are getting better at keeping jellyfish, their lifespan has magically stretched all the way to like a decade.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so like they don't have any real organs, right? They don't have a brain or a heart or anything. So they're so simple that if you're keeping them in like ideal conditions, they can grow and keep living for like crazy amounts of time. So yeah.
So do you speculate as aquaculture continues that will get hardier, so to speak? Like they're just
Yeah, I think so. Right. In the wild, jellyfish are highly seasonal, so it's normal for them to show up and then after like 4 to 6 months, they kind of die back. But keeping them in captivity, like I said, like the record for moon jellyfish is 12 years in captivity. So yeah, I think as we get better and better, I think that's going to be stretched. I normally tell people, like hobbyists, like 2 to 4 years is pretty good for a lifespan. As long as you're past a year, you've already beat like the average that people are going around saying. So, but yeah, I expect in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be keeping them for much longer.
So this is kind of I think I've maybe seen this with upside down jellies. Can you actually frag any of the adults themselves?
Yeah, so most jellyfish, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Upside down jellies, possibly, because they're photosynthetic, so they have some way of obtaining nutrition while they're, healing. But they're a lot like trying to frag a scully or something, that it takes them a long time to fully kind of round back over. So it's possible, but it's a lot like spawning corals. It's like you could frag a jellyfish, or you could spend a few months' time and produce like 10,000 of them. Like
Yeah, yeah.
um, Yeah, but there are certain species that have been known to like split themselves in half at the jellyfish stage, and like that's one of their modes of reproduction. So it's certainly possible.
Hmm. Let's see. So yeah, we talked on like you mentioned like the myth of lifespan. Are there any other common misconceptions or myths that you see a lot?
This one I think is like starting to go away now, but for a while people were saying that jellyfish were all cold water.
Hmm.
And the reason that started is so like the public aquariums on the West Coast, like especially in California, were some of the ones to like originally breed jellyfish. But they were doing all local species. So it was like all of these California natives that thrive at like 55, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they were sharing them at the polyp stage with other public aquariums. And so all of a sudden everyone had jellyfish, but they were all cold water. But now, I mean, like moon jellies in particular, like they have like 30 species, and you can find them in the Philippines, you can find them in Arctic regions, and everywhere in between. And so a lot of the species we keep now, like they do fine at room temperature. There's tropical versions, there's cold water species. So there's basically a jellyfish for every environment. You just kind of pick one that suits you and what you have available.
Is like the light you mentioned, like they don't really like super bright lights. It's kind of like the ambient RGB type of lighting. Is that harmful in any way, or like could it be?
Doesn't seem like it. I know in the wild, jellyfish do like operate on a lighting cycle. Like when I want to get a jellyfish to spawn, one of the things I'll do is shine a bright light on them for 12 hours.
Hmm.
Um, but like in aquariums, a lot of the times you'll see that like RGB lighting because something like a moon jellyfish, which is opaque, will kind of, glow whatever color of light you shine on them. And so far, there doesn't seem to be any negative effects of doing that. So, yeah.
So going back to collection, how are you collecting them? Like is it like gotta have like a fishing license? You take a bucket. Like what's the whole kind of pipeline there?
Yeah, so it super depends on where you are, right? Like jellyfish, again, kind of bottom of the totem pole for priority. So a lot of places do not care. Like here in North Carolina, they're not strictly mentioned in the law surrounding what you can and can't collect. So just bare minimum, you need a fishing license, and like that's it. Places like California, Florida that have like more regulations in place, you'd want to research that. There's usually some sort of permit for collecting wildlife involved. But yeah, it depends like where you are. But yeah, collection wise, like I normally just bring buckets with me, and bags and all that, and then you just go find them. Like docks are great places because you can walk back and forth and see what's coming in with the tides. The biggest thing is you never want to take a jellyfish out of water because they're 95% water, so they'll just start to fall apart. You can't like, go and scoop them up with a net, right? Like you've got to scoop them up with a bag or like a cup or a bucket or something. Yeah.
In terms of like getting stung, like any gloves, that's like enough protection at that point.
Yeah, they sting in a very similar way to like corals and stuff. So gloves are fine. If you're planning on really getting in there, like those arm length gloves are good. Most of the jellyfish we work with in the hobby have very minor stings, and captive bred jellies have less sting than their wild counterparts. Um, I don't know. I'm assuming it's because they're less like they're desensitized to it in the wild. Everything they bump into is potentially food, so they're just going to sting everything they touch. But in captivity, they're a little more tailored to the environment. So if you're out there collecting wild jellies, it's probably a good idea to wear gloves and all that. But yeah, like most of the jellyfish I handle, I don't even wear gloves anymore. Yeah. I mean, it's like handling carpet anemones or whatever, right? Like sometimes you get stung, sometimes you don't.
So if you just like got used to some of this, you just got like hands of God now, like immune.
Yeah, so like in some of the like jellyfish groups I'm in, like public aquariums and stuff, some people develop like more intense reactions over time. Like the more you get stung, the more your immune system gets sensitive to it. But like I have not experienced that. Like
Hmm.
they just don't really bother me. No, I mean, again, if I'm working with like box jellyfish, where like they could potentially really hurt you, like I'm gonna wear
Yeah.
gloves. You know.
So there's no regulations around owning box jellies at this point. You just like,
No, but like every regulation was written because of some example, right? So like the jellyfish hobby is still really early in its growth. I'm sure at some point, someone's gonna get stung and killed by some box jellyfish they imported from Australia. And then, it'll reach the Senate or whatever, and they'll start passing regulations. But right now, there's none of that.
so do you have any of the box jellies in your collection, like the ones that can actually be bred very easily?
Yeah, I have 5 or 6 species. Yeah, spanning a couple of different kinds.
Are they
Um,
venomous, like any of them?
they all sting, so all of them sting pretty badly except for one, but none of them are like strictly lethal.
Okay, that's good.
So like I'm careful about handling them because they can potentially put you into like anaphylaxis or something, but yeah, none of them are like the Australian deadly, species like that.
Do you have any lethal species?
No, I don't think so.
That's probably good. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Again, not trying to be the first guy to set an example, right? Like,
I was gonna ask, I'm like, well, if you have some lethal species, I'm gonna get a tank, and I really want one here, just because like, that's what a great conversation piece, man. People come to the studio, it's like, yeah, this could kill you if you touch it. Got this hellfire anemone that could kill you if you touch it. I have this
right.
electric eel here that could kill you if you touch it. Just
Blue
like
ring
the wall
octopus.
of death. Yeah, blue ring
Right,
octopus. Just
right,
like
right.
all the stuff that everyone's afraid to keep, but they're beautiful animals that like no one talks about. That's a yeah.
I have colleagues that raise the irukandji box jellyfish, which is like that really tiny one that can kill you.
Yeah.
Um, and part of me is like, I would love to ask them. Like that would be a great addition to like the jellyfish compendium to like document them. But I'm like, I'm kind of like, I'm afraid to even ask them. Like that might be insulting to
I feel like that would be like a very useful one to document. I mean,
Yeah, I
like
agree.
those species that can be like dangerous to humans. I think that's very useful, applicable information that goes beyond, like people could actually pick that up and maybe like do something like product development wise with that or something. Oh, what was her name? She actually spoke at my university because her niece was like in my class. First name's Angel. Her last name starts with a Y. She's like University of Hawaii, and she helped develop whatever that like
Oh,
cream is.
I know her. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
She
she was
studies box
cool.
jellyfish. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I got to hear her talk in college. That was a pretty cool conversation. She's like, "Yeah, it took me like 10 years. We found out the mechanism of the toxin, and it's zinc. You put zinc on your body."
Yep. Like I said, zinc is toxic to jellyfish. So yeah, I guess that makes sense. Um, yeah, I think she was like a biochemist that got stung one time in Hawaii really bad, and like it started like a hole. She's like, I'm gonna fix this.
Yeah, she had a really cool
So,
like it wasn't just research now. She just dedicated her life to like jellyfish stuff. So they'll go to like
mhm.
the Philippines or like they went to Vietnam and they teach like locals how to do like actual treatment and stuff that's effective.
Yeah,
It's cool. It's cool
yeah,
talk.
absolutely, yeah. And I mean that kind of stuff like really brings people together, right? Like I went down to Florida a couple years ago to collect that box jellyfish that I'm having a hard time breeding in captivity. And I couldn't find any. Like they were there the day before. I drove all the way down there and I couldn't find any. So like as a last ditch effort, I started looking on Facebook, like just Googling like the name of the jellyfish and seeing people's posts and where they were. And I found this lady that like posted a picture of her leg where she'd gotten stung like all the way down. Super gnarly. But I, on a whim, I just messaged her on Facebook and was like, where did you find those? And she's like, you know what? Like, I got a boat. Like, when I get off work, you want to meet me at the dock? And I'm like, I'll take you there. And she did. And we found them. Right. But like, I got this whole afternoon of like interviewing her and like other locals that visit this like sandbar and got stung, all over the place. And like I'm still friends with these people like years later. So yeah.
I mean, that's how I see like public support and funding coming into jellyfish research, is tying it to that. Because most people are like, and like if you mentioned that, they'd probably be interested to know, like, oh, this
Yeah.
is actually how I treat. If I get stung, maybe I should not pour vinegar on it. You mean like stuff like that?
Right. Yeah, and I think like even my kind of stuff, like the life cycle of them, right? There's a lot to learn there. Like why some years do they show up by the millions and then other years they're gone? And
Yeah.
are we doing something that's causing this, or is it more purely environmental, or are they just cyclical? Yeah, so there's a lot of room for that kind of stuff.
Do you ever? I mean, I don't know if this. Maybe it exists. I don't know. Do you see there being some type of like public protection on like very packed beaches type of thing? Like, is there a way to like have low enough like size like nets or something to block them out? Or I mean, I don't know.
They do that in Australia. They set up these like net pens that you can swim in, that keep out the bigger box jellies, but like those irukandji ones that are like the size of a Christmas light, they slip right through them. Yeah, so it's possible, but it depends on the species for sure.
Stay in the pool is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. You can still see the ocean from the hotel pool, right? Like,
yeah, you get like the simulation of being in the water. It's
right, exactly.
That's funny. Okay, so I am gonna do jellyfish at the studio. I think I'm gonna do maybe a column tank, a chrysal tank, but I'm very interested in making a tumbler tank now, like modifying an all-in-one. So I'll definitely do moons. I'm gonna have a lagoon style kind of shallow reef. I might do upside downs in. Should I just jump to combs? Should I just do it? What should I do? What do you think?
If you can raise rotifers, I think go for comb jellies.
Okay, I've done rotifers. Rotifers suck, but I've done them.
Or if you can find someone near you that does it and has extra rotifers that you can just every now and then.
you just mean they need? I thought you meant they were comparable to growing rotifers. I understand what you mean now.
Okay, yeah.
They need rotifers.
Yeah, especially if you want to breed them. But even then, like the adults do better on rotifers than like brine shrimp for whatever reason.
Okay.
Or copepods. Like if you have someone that you're buying copepods from or who raises them, like you could use that too.
You need like Naplii then in that instance? Or can you do like adults like APO or something?
Yeah, if you're doing like if the jellies are adults and you're just keeping them for fun, then adult copepods should be fine. If you're trying to raise them through their life cycle, you need like the NOPs.
So
like how do you pelagic species?
How do you induce the spawning for those? Is it just like, I mean, does it just happen? Like it seems like they're kind of like rabbits. Those guys are.
It's light cycle.
Okay.
Yeah, night and day, that sort of thing. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna get some comb jellies. I'm
decided.
I need to get. You're gonna have to mail me some polyps in an inconspicuous package with like hazard labels on it. Like make it look as much like a domestic terror threat as possible. I'm like,
okay, right, yeah. I'll include a letter that's like all magazine cut out. Like
the Jellyfish Manifesto. It's like these people have to learn. Well, cool, Travis. Are you currently selling any jellies through the Jellyfish warehouse, or is your full efforts on the compendium right now?
Both, honestly. Like I'll raise different species, and when I have extras, I throw them on the website, just to help cover the expenses of doing all of this. I'm definitely not at the scale I used to be, but I'm still trying to offer cool species that you can't get anywhere else. And all that. So trying to keep, at least a little bit on there at all times.
So if people want to find you, Jellyfish Compendium, Jellyfish Warehouse, anywhere else they can reach you at, any other good places?
I run a Facebook group, the Jellyfish Owners Association. That's got people from like literally all over the planet, like everyone from jellyfish researchers to just a hobbyist. And it's like full of people who just love answering questions about jellyfish, so I always recommend people join that if you're new to keeping jellyfish and just kind of like dig through it. People are posting all the time about their setup or, what jellyfish they're keeping. And I made the group, so I moderate it, chime in every now and then and offer help.
Can people trade you? Do you have a reef tank right now at all? Do you have any?
Yeah.
Can people trade you frags for jellyfish?
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah. Because, I have lots of jellyfish, and then I have this, so I have like a 400-gallon reef system, and it is pretty sparse right now. Like, I did the whole go big or go home, but then like I have to fill it up with coral now. So
Yeah, that's like a very slow process. That's especially 400 gallons. Oh my God, it's gonna take
yeah,
a while.
exactly. Right.
You're probably gonna get like a billion invoice, like requests. Like I've got a home wrecker frag. Can I get these jellies?
Right.
Well,
I'm
cool.
totally okay with that.
Is there any other tidbits of jellyfish wisdom you would like to share while you're on the platform?
I guess so. Like I said, with jellyfish and water quality, like they don't mind if it's not perfect, but they don't love change that happens too quickly. Again, a lot like corals, like you want to keep your parameters stable. You don't want your temperature to jump 10 degrees every day or whatever. So like that's the biggest thing is just like relative stability.
Stability is key.
Yep,
It's
always.
everything in the saltwater hobby, man. It's
You can't escape it.
Nidarians need it. We need it. It all makes sense.
Exactly.
Well, Mr. Brandwood, I appreciate you coming on the Reef Therapy podcast, and hopefully
Absolutely.
people can get interested in the very therapeutic aspect of watching some jellyfish float around in the future. This episode has been brought to you by Cali Kid Corals, the ultimate coral experience. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment your favorite jellyfish fact. Tune in for the next episode. Be there or be square.